In his mind, this kind of a person is continually contrasting himself with conservatives, and when he hears about them, with libertarians. And he believes that these people are not well-intentioned. In fact, the single most important characteristic for discriminating parties, political parties, in the liberal's mind is their intentions, not their economics. He doesn't know economics. Not their foreign policy. He knows that's hopeless. Not even problems like inflation, which he figures are something he can't quite figure out. When the liberal looks at a party and its platform, in his mind he discriminates, are they good guys or are they bad guys? And in particular, are they well-intentioned or are they badly intentioned? And if you ask a liberal or an advantaged idealist or a humanist or a humanitarian of the kind I'm speaking about, if you ask this person, what is a communist? He will say, it is a person with exaggerated good intentions. And that is precisely how the psychology of this individual is working, and it is precisely how my own psychology worked over this period of years. I'm going to skip some of the material as I go along. I've never given this talk before. It's the first time I've thought all this through, and I may have to hesitate now and again to make sure I know just where I am and if I've covered everything. So, one of the things that I felt being lucky and being advantaged, rather, one of the things I felt being advantaged that is quite crucial here is that while I felt that I had had good luck, I did not feel lucky. The liberal, with all his advantages, with all the good things he has, feels burdened by them. There's no joy in it. In fact, in my practice, when I deal with these people, it's very hard for them to even use their abilities, to make as much money as they could. One young man said to me that he would always, he thought maybe my libertarianism in his personal life was going to be good for him, which is very interesting. That's very common. I mean, a lot of liberals in my practice really thrive. They apply libertarian principles of self-interest to their own personal lives. It's hard for them, but over a period of time they're able to learn. But as one young man said to me, I'll always believe from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And I looked at him and I said, well, no wonder you never get your professional life off the ground. You have to give it away. Well, the liberal doesn't realize this. He's so stuck in the guilt system that he has a terrible time getting out of it and even imagining a connection between his politics and, for what it is, it's not very articulated politics, and his own psychology. Now, part of feeling so guilty and feeling that while you have all the luck in the world, that you're still unlucky, part of this is the concept that goes along for almost all these people I'm talking about, including myself as I grew up. In fact, my mother even said this, good guys finish last. You see how it sort of all dovetails together into one consistent psychology that explains an inconsistent politic. For the liberal, good guys finish last. He sees himself in a society using dog image in which the top dogs run it and the underdogs get stuck. And he himself is most afraid that with the top dogs and the underdogs that a dog-eat-dog competition is going to do in everybody. Which leads me to quip that this is why the country is going into dogs. This is genuinely what the liberal feels and thinks in his heart of hearts much of the time. Another part that goes along with this psychology is that the liberal in his heart of hearts thinks that if he wasn't lucky, he would be in terrible shape. And I remember feeling that with all my advantages, I was very unhappy and guilt-ridden. And it leads him to think that the poor would have to be in even worse shape than he. So that he, being miserable and guilt-ridden with his advantages, he begins to look upon the poor as sort of an exaggerated example of himself. I had a lot of feelings like this until I met my wife, who'd grown up in western Pennsylvania in a small steel town, whose mother had raised the family for many years without her father, working on an assembly line, earning like $60 a week and having 4 children. And I met my wife when she was 20 and I was 34, and when I would speak about liberalism, she would say, in effect, you know, don't feel sorry for me, I don't believe in that baloney. It had very, very, very powerful impact on me. She also gave me Fountainhead to read. Another funny story about that, I hadn't heard anything about libertarianism other, of course, I'd worked with Thomas Zosky years, but Tom never talked in those terms of, you know, of a libertarian movement in those days. None of us did, and I never thought about it. And my first novel, The Crazy from the Sane, is a very heavy critique of psychiatry, and my wife, then my girlfriend, was sitting in my office, Phyllis, and I was reading my mail, and I got this letter, and I said, gee, Phil, there's a psychologist who likes my novel. I'm amazed. I didn't think any psychologist or psychiatrist would like my novel. And I started to throw it in the basket, and she said, what's his name? I said, Brandon, I think. And she leaped up and said, my hero! Liberalism, as I'm beginning to describe it to you now, is more a religion than a politic. And it starts, as everybody knows, for most people, in adolescence. If you think back to your own adolescence, you might be able to easily see you may have been liberals in your own adolescence. In a sense, liberalism is the adolescent's attempt at absolution for his guilt over lucky advantages. He's acutely aware of comparisons to other people. It pains him as a result of his upbringing, his schooling, and his government telling him it should pain him. And it also pains him because of the natural affinity we have for other human beings. We don't like to live in a world in which there's suffering and disadvantage. That's some of the better motives. There is a certain, you know, love for life and people that most of us feel in adolescence and then sort of get kicked out of us, unfortunately. So the adolescent liberal is really developing not an economic or political theory, since he doesn't read very much, but he's developing a religion that's going to make him feel better. And the feeling better is the declaration, as all adolescents are extremely eager to make, that he himself, while advantaged, feels terrible about it and has good intentions toward the disadvantaged. And so he begins looking for places to work and things to do. As one of my own daughters is, to help disadvantaged people. And I'm going to play her the speech and see what she thinks about her own intentions, whether she's doing it out of love or whether she's doing it out of guilt. And remember, this adolescent also is beginning to think that other people are bad intentions. He's beginning to make that division of the universe. Now, what does the government become for him? Well, if you think about every adolescent's dream when he's feeling guilty and terrible and feeling impotent, which most adolescents do, his dream is, if only I were in charge, then I would do good things, even though he has no concept of it. Liberalism, then, in the adolescent form, which is the form most of us are going to see it in, is an enormous expansion of every adolescent's guilty belief that everything would be better if only I were in charge. That's why it's so hard to reason with him about anything, such as Vietnam. Talk about Vietnam, and he's likely to talk about General Westmoreland or McNamara. Talk about Watergate, and he'll talk about Nixon. In his mind, the problem has always been that the bad guys and the top dogs are in charge, and his idea is for the good guys and the well-intentioned and the underdogs to be in charge. And if not him, at least it will be a person who has good intentions. And I think probably in Jimmy Carter we have the epitome of this more than we have ever had in the history of the country. The well-intentioned Christian gentleman, you know, who's even sinned in his heart. He has his guilt, but who has the best of all possible intentions. Conservatives, by contrast, are simply in a wholly different wavelength. I mean, they're working more out of fear as they grow older, and they learn that they have earned something in life. This is why people get conservative as they grow old. They learn, A, that it does take damn hard work, even if you're advantaged, to keep your head afloat. And they learn that there's great danger in losing it all. So the conservative turns then to his morality, his family, his Christianity, and says, I've got to preserve this through my morality and through my ethics. And he takes a very different position from the liberal, who's not at all focused on himself, but is focused almost wholly on other people. If you think I exaggerate about the religious element, think about the New York Times or the Washington Post, or any of the liberal newspapers. I forget what they are out here in L.A. They're almost entirely owned, written, and read by advantaged classes. And the paper consists almost entirely of ruminations about the plight of the disadvantaged classes and the sins of the advantaged classes. In other words, the liberal media, to some extent at least, is fundamentally a religious media whose purpose is to inflame and at the same time absolve the guilt of the advantaged classes. There's very little else in the papers. And what else there is, the people I'm talking about don't read. I never read the financial page in my life until I became a libertarian. Very few. And read what the financial page is in these newspapers. I mean, you wouldn't believe that the whole fate of the world is being determined by a process that gets 2 or 3 or 4 crummy pages in a giant newspaper. So liberalism in the form I'm talking about, and I'm not indicting all liberals, but in the form I'm talking about, liberalism is the religion of guilt-ridden advantaged classes, and in a sense it preaches God helps those who help not themselves, but others. And it's the infusion of government with a personal religion, which makes me think that maybe we ought to fight much of liberalism on the grounds that it really is crossing the barrier between church and state, infusing this guilt-ridden secular religion upon us through our government. Next, I'm not going to have time. I'm going to real quickly examine just some issues very quickly to sort of show how they fit in and then make some recommendations to you. And I'm not going to have time for questions. But I'll be glad to get together in the lobby that's up one. There's a place that somebody can lead me to that's up a flight where we could go talk and answer questions afterward. But if you want to know, if you ask yourself, why can liberals have one project after another that fails, one on top of the other, and continue pursuing it, it's because they're not oriented, remember, to their effect in the world, but to assuaging their guilt. And what better than to fail again and again and to repeat again and again and show your good intentions again and again and again. It also explains why the liberal has such a tendency to have these no growth, no energy, no anything politics that's coming along now. It's part of this leveling process of making everybody about as lucky as he is, only now reaching a point of desperation, luckier than anybody, less lucky than anybody has been. Even in the ACLU, if you look at the libertarianism of the ACLU, it's an underdog libertarianism. Not fighting for the rights of businessmen, it's fighting for the rights of the underdog. You know, when I first heard that the ACLU defended Nazis, I thought, wow, that must be libertarianism, but it isn't. Nazis are the underdog now. ACLU would never defend them if they had any power. It also explains why liberals will read and associate with communists but loathe conservatives, because communists have exaggerated good intentions, whereas the conservatives have bad intentions. Now, I want to make some very specific recommendations, which themselves could take quite a bit of time, but I thought I'd give you the basic ideas about motives, and then you can do a lot more on your own. First and foremost, we have to approach the liberal as a person who is not primarily interested in his own self-interest. There is no way around it in your personal conversations. As much as it may hurt you to your core of cores, if you convince the liberal that libertarianism is in his self-interest, you will vote Democratic twice as hard. If you can convince him, as we're trying to, that he is suffering, he'll be very angry at you. He doesn't suffer. The disadvantaged classes suffer. Now, this may change as the economy totally collapses, but it may not. It hasn't changed in England. It may not. You see, it may be that no form of collapse can make this individual turn and look at his own self-interest first. First, he's going to look at somebody else's self-interest. 99% of what is written for and by libertarians is about the self-interest of the reader. We will never become a major party in that manner. We not only have to, we are the party of freedom, but we can't orient ourselves as the party of self-interest. We have to orient ourselves as a party of freedom that can show that freedom also helps the disadvantaged classes. We have many, many explanations within libertarianism of how the disadvantaged classes can be helped by libertarianism. I have one metaphor or a specific suggestion. I won't give too many of those because lots of people have more than I do. But one image that I get that impresses liberals is I ask them to remember the movies they've seen of the turn-of-the-century New York ghettos filled with immigrants. How busy they were. You couldn't walk down the street. There were people vending, there were people making things, there were people running about doing errands, there were people selling vegetables, there were people walking from house to house offering services to fix your plumbing or fix your wall or fix whatever there is. Now take a look at 1970 at the black ghetto. The difference is not between the immigrant and the black, it is between government control. There's no activity on the streets of the black ghetto, it's all illegal. In Washington, D.C., you have to have a license to be a vendor. You have to have a license to be a plumber, to be a carpenter, to be just about anything in Washington, D.C. And these restraints, and many, many others which you could enumerate, since you're a libertarian audience, I won't, but all of these restraints are what makes the black ghetto so dead and what made the ghetto that my fathers moved into so alive. And you can just get that imagery right out of the movies. You've all seen pictures of these old ghettos, and they all know what the new ones look like. And that image alone, I think, can do a great deal to turn liberals on to the fact that we care about people, and that people are being stultified by the government. So summarizing my first major point, we have to have much less emphasis on the personal advantage of libertarianism to the idealist, and a lot more on its advantages to the poor. Second, we've got to develop an ideal, and we don't have too many people working on this. We have to develop an ideal of helping others based on something other than guilt. Because the liberal knows himself. He knows it's guilt, and he has grave doubts about whether that's going to work if there isn't government. He has grave doubts whether anybody out of love and joy would ever give charity to another human being. His great doubts whether the high and mighty who are guilt-free, as he perceives them, are going to give away any of their money. So we have to go back to concepts like Adam Smith's fellow feeling. You know, Adam Smith talked about this. He said human beings have fellow feeling for each other. They put each other in each other's situations. This is probably my major life's work, in a sense. It's 2/3 of what my psychology of freedom is going to be about, which is love from the viewpoint of the rational, self-interested person. How and why we do care about the self-interest of others. And this is very, very important. There's a much better way to go about it than guilt. And that's through genuinely feeling something happy about the opportunity of your fellow men to be free, to prosper, and women, and to grow. Third, we must become not just the party of principle, but the party of good intentions. We absolutely have to be seen as the party of good intentions, or we will fail. When you are talking to the media, when you are talking to your liberal friends, never, never take for granted that they think you have good intentions. They do not. Their whole guilt system is defended on the grounds that they've got good intentions, and you don't. Keep it in mind. It's extremely important. I know it's going to make our candidate look a little bit like Jimmy Carter, but he's got to reaffirm over and over again in one subtle or direct way or another that we are the party of good intentions, the party of the best possible intentions. And in doing this, we're going to have to communicate that we know that libertarianism, if implemented and as it is implemented, will bring radical adjustments in the society that cause pain to people. We have to admit it, and then we have to say we're going to be aware of it. We're going to do something about it. We can't stand up with slick slogans and say, well, this is how everybody in step A, B, C, D, E is going to benefit. It isn't so. People will have problems. People will be in pain. People will lose jobs, even if they're boondoggle jobs. But they are people. We've got to keep that in mind. I'm delighted to get applause for saying this, and I think it's really, really crucial to us. I think it's the most crucial thing we're going to face in convincing other human beings. We've got the data, and we've got to show it. As a part of this, I also recommend strongly that in stating that you are the party of good intentions, you show that your intentions are so good that, in fact, big bureaucratic corporate structure of the United States does not back libertarianism. I cannot tell you the dismay and disbelief I get from my liberal friends when I tell them that we are not supported by General Motors. That's how little they understand. We've got to communicate to them we have such good intentions that those guys don't want anything to do with us. Very, very important. Another thing, we must never, never be flip or callous about suffering. Let's just suppose that the city you live in, Cleveland, San Francisco, goes bankrupt and collapses and the system falls apart. There's a tendency on some libertarians' parts, not too many, to cheer it and say, proving our thesis, the cities are collapsing. It won't work. There are people in the cities. There are old ladies that have New York State bonds. There are old ladies and old men who have U.S. government bonds. We must never, while we watch what is happening and demonstrate that our predictions have been unhappily correct, we must never act as if that we are such egoists, or egotists, better, not egoists, which is good, but egotists, that we're going to be joyful over our predictions and say that the other folks, some 75-year-old lady, was just a damn fool for having U.S. government bonds. We've got to be thinking about these things and communicating about these things to people in a very serious manner, never in a flip manner, never in a clever manner. In foreign policy, the liberal is concerned with exactly that which he is concerned with in his domestic policy. He is for disadvantaged peoples. There are two tendencies, I'll be through in about 2 minutes. There are two tendencies that I want to speak about in particular. One is the question of Israel. There is in the libertarian literature an enormous amount of antagonism toward Israel, I think more than toward probably most other nations in the world. If we feel that the U.S. government shouldn't support Israel, we should not at the same time deny the motivation behind Israel, the death and agony of millions and millions of people, and the fact that the Jews could go nowhere. So if you're going to talk to a liberal about Israel and still have him be thinking you're sane, you're going to have to say something to him like this. Listen, nobody denies the Holocaust. Nobody denies that the Jews had absolutely no place to go. Nobody denies that any Jew with a brain in his head picked up a gun and went to Israel when he couldn't get anywhere else. But don't forget, it was Franklin Roosevelt who wouldn't let the Jews come to America. We must show the liberals that it is the liberals, if anything, and in fact it is, the Roosevelt, who set up a situation. Hitler was glad to get rid of the Jews for a small price, money. At least it seems like that in the beginning, and nobody would take the Jews, and we certainly could have, but Roosevelt was a politician. And this is what's got to be emphasized. Don't go talking about Israel of all nations, the one nation founded on the slaughter of its own people, as if it's an evil process. It's a process that comes out of the inevitable problems of statehood and closed borders and things like that. And that must be emphasized. Talk about the disadvantaged Arabs and the disadvantaged Israelis, and explain how libertarianism could help or avoid such situations. Similarly, there's something that's absolutely nothing to do with the party, but which must be mentioned because it has to do with libertarianism, and that is South Africa. Now, the Libertarian Party, and probably every libertarian in this room, hates South Africa as one of the most oppressive nations on earth. But we're likely to get tagged with having a romance with South Africa. We are bombarded with requests to invest in South Africa. There are books that have been sold by libertarian bookstores describing the happy blacks playing in their compounds so that you'll buy, what? Gold stocks in African gold mines. The fact that a country has gold in its ground does not make it a libertarian nation. And I know that nobody in this room thinks that it is, but there's a lot of propaganda going on trying to sell South Africa to libertarians because of our love of gold in part and diamonds, and also because it's easy to forget that the rugged individualistic capitalistic tendencies of that country are for white folks only. So it's very, very important on Israel and Africa to make very, very clear what our positions are, that, you know, that these countries have their liabilities, that Africa having gold does not make it a libertarian nation, and Israel being a country we're not going to single out as the one and only or the most vilified of them. When you talk about economics, talk about advantage. Talk about the disadvantaged classes. Talk about how advantage isn't necessarily unearned, and that one man's advantage isn't necessarily another person's disadvantage. This is something liberals have a lot of trouble with, but it's very, very important. Finally, remember that guilt and love are two different things. And you might, if you really have a liberal friend that you're close to, talk about that. Ask him whether he does what he does out of pain or out of love. And try to convince him that there's a tremendous connection between love and liberty. And that when you love somebody, you don't want to help him against his will. When you love somebody, you don't want to make somebody else help him. When you love somebody, you want to see somebody free. Freedom and love go together. Thank you very, very much for being so kind. Thank you.
The next talk I'm going to do in a minute about Jeff Breggin. I think it's going to be, I'd rather live up to this one. Today, I think it's not yet. We'll be talking about